he made a distinction between sensorial attention and intellectual attention. Sensorial attention is when you direct your attention to stimulus, to objects in the sensory field. Paying attention to you, paying attention to her, all that kind of stuff. Intellectual attention is where your attention is turned inward on images or ideas or memories, stuff that's not out there in the environment, but still you're paying attention to it. If I should now lapse into a daydream and think about those things that I daydream about, instead of thinking about you, okay, my attention has been turned inward instead of being turned outward where it belongs. The second distinction that James made is between immediate attention and apperceptive attention. In immediate attention, you pay attention to an object because it is what James called intrinsically interesting. It's really bright, or really loud, or really big, or it's coming at you really fast. There is something about that object that draws your attention to it, as opposed to what James called apperceptive attention, using a 19th century term that nobody uses anymore, which basically says that that attention is devoted to an object not because of its physical features, but because of its meaning, because of something that makes it interesting, makes it worthy of your attention. And then finally, James made a distinction between passive attention and active attention. There is attention that is kind of automatically drawn to objects that are novel or surprising or loud or whatever. Somebody walks in the door, just kind of distracts you for a second, and then you can turn your attention back to something else. That's passive attention. And then there's voluntary attention, where you actually say, I'm going to pay attention to this thing right now and ignore other things. So the light of the projector in the back booth or whatever. So James by employing this kind of classification scheme, wanted us to understand that attention is not there are different kinds of attention. They're not all necessarily the same kind of thing. More recently, Marvin Chun, who's a professor at Yale, probably one of the most interesting people doing work in attention these days, has listed some properties of attention that are important to us. The first is that attention has limited capacity. Remember George Miller's famous paper on the magical number 7 plus or minus 2, in which he argued that there are limits to the number of things we can keep in mind at any particular time. This is what Chun is talking about as well. The environment, there's more going on in the environment, a lot more information in the environment than we can process in any particular time. The second aspect of attention that Chun points out is what he calls selection, which is that when we're moving through our environment, there are lots of things out there that are competing for attention. We pay attention to some of them at the expense of ignoring the others. We do that by modulating attention, by actively directing our attention towards some things, facilitating the processing of some objects in our environment, and inhibiting the processing of other objects in the environment. And then finally, attention just isn't captured and then fades away. We're able to sustain our attention to various objects over long periods of time. And a surprising event occurs, my attention might be drawn to it momentarily, and then I can fasten my attention on that thing and keep it in mind by virtue of some kind of deliberate act. Chun has also talked about what's known as the architecture of attention, in which he picks up on one of James's distinctions, the distinction between sensorial attention and intellectual attention. Chun calls it external versus internal. When we external attention enables us to focus on and process information coming to us from various sensory modalities. It allows us to pay attention to what we're seeing as opposed to what we're hearing. It allows us to look at the spatial location of whatever it is we're paying attention to, the various features of objects in the external in the external world. Internal attention, like James's intellectual variety, is focused inward. first and foremost on what Chun calls response selection. I see this thing, what am I going to do about it? Am I going to ignore it? Am I going to approach it? Am I going to withdraw from it, or whatever? And also, internal attention allows us to retrieve information from long-term memory. Okay, my grandmother is not present in the physical environment right now, but I'm able to think back and retrieve memories from my encounters with her. And also working memory. Once I've started thinking about my grandmother, I can maintain that representation in working memory and keep thinking about her even though she isn't present. So this is one aspect of the architecture of attention that's quite important. Another aspect, which is drawn to our attention, if you will, by a psychologist at Berkeley, Bill Prinzmetal, and Ayelet Landau, in a very important paper, in which they made a distinction between voluntary attention on the one hand and involuntary attention on the other. Voluntary attention is attention that we deliberately pay to various kinds of events, whether they're external events in the sensory field or internal events retrieved from memory. This is kind of goal-directed attention. It's attention that we pay in order to accomplish some various kind of goal. And then there is involuntary attention. This is a kind of attention that is captured by salient or surprising stimuli in the environment. Classic example is when somebody walks toward you and they've got something written on their T-shirt, you just can't help but look at it. Okay, that thing just captures your attention, and you want to read it. It's stimulus-driven, not goal-driven. And Prinzmetal and Landau in this paper argue that this is not just a dimension of attention. These are two quite different forms of attention that have different kinds of consequences for information processing, and in fact are served by somewhat different modules in the brain. So again, that's what the architecture of attention is all about. So now let's turn from these broad theories of attention, from James to Chun to Prinzmetal, and look at what the literature on attention actually tells us about this faculty. Studies of attention have been going on in psychology for a very long time. R.S. Woodworth, who wrote the earliest handbook of experimental psychology, devoted his career to studying what he called the span of apprehension, culminating in George Miller's paper on the magical number 7 plus or minus 2. But a lot of early work on attention was stimulated by very practical applications. For example, in World War II, especially in Europe, there were lots of airplanes flying around from lots of different countries doing lots of different things, and a new profession of air traffic controller had to be devised. People who could actually keep tabs on lots of different objects flying around in the sky all at once, so that they didn't crash into each other, they didn't land unexpectedly, they didn't take off unexpectedly. That is a very, very attention-demanding task. And so the question was raised, for example, how many planes can an air traffic controller keep in mind at any particular time? A very practical problem that underlay studies of this basic psychological function. Later on, when people started getting dial telephones, around the same time when people started getting dial telephones, people started getting telephone numbers. We had to, engineers at AT&T, essentially psychologists, had to figure out what the optimum length for a telephone number is, okay? We don't have this problem too much anymore because most of you don't think about telephone numbers. You just have your smartphones and you dial up Janie or Joey or whatever. But there was a time when people actually had to memorize people's telephone numbers. And there are limits to that. There's a reason why people's telephone numbers are 7 digits long. Because of the magical number 7 plus or minus 2, right? Then when the telephone system got really big, we had to add area codes. that's a glitch. But we don't think about area codes as 3 digits. We think about area codes as a chunk of 1 digit. So if you live in the East Bay, your area code is 510. If you live in San Francisco, your area code is 415, more or less. And even the exchange numbers, those first 3 digits in a 7-digit telephone number, those can be thought of as chunks. All UC Berkeley telephone numbers begin with 642 or 643. So once you know that, you don't have to think about that either. And then you can just think about the 4-digit number. But still, these are practical considerations about how much attention we can pay. On the basis of these kinds of studies performed in the 30s and the 40s and the 50s, we learned for sure these what are thought of as first facts about attention. First, that attention is limited, that there's just only so much information you can hold in your mind at one particular time. And then second, that attention can be controlled. An air traffic controller can pay attention to a particular plane passing across his or her radar screen and not be distracted by all the other blips that are appearing there. And then finally, as I said before, that attention really is the path to short-term or working memory. Okay, on the basis of these first facts, a guy by the name of Broadbent, a British psychologist, proposed the very first what's known as a filter model of attention. And the general idea behind the filter model is that there's a whole bunch of stuff out there competing for our limited attentional resource. And the way we pay attention is essentially by selectively filtering out all but a small amount of this information. Okay, that's the basic idea behind the filter model. You have all this information impinging on your sensory mechanisms. Then there's what Broadbent called a short-term store. We would now call this the sensory registers, the icon, the echo. And then there's a selective filter, which then passes a small amount of all this information into this limited capacity the processor. That's basically how attention was supposed to work. And Broadbent based this the theory not just on the first facts that I talked about before, but on a series of experiments done by one of his colleagues named Cherry on what's known as dichotic listening. Dichotic listening is a laboratory model of something that everybody has experienced. It's called the cocktail party phenomenon. You go to a party, you encounter somebody, you start interacting with that person, and as you're focused on that particular individual, the rest of the world kind of fades into the background until somebody says, "John," and then you kind of are distracted by that somehow. But mostly, when you're talking to somebody, you're paying attention to that particular person and not doing anything else. Well, what Cherry did was to develop a laboratory model of this called dichotic listening, in which the subject had earphones put on his ears, and he or she was directed to pay attention to the message coming over one ear, but to ignore a competing message coming over another ear. So there are 2 messages, 1 to each ear, attend to one, and ignore the other one. And we know that they're that they're attending to it because we ask them to actually shadow the message, that is, repeat the message that they're supposed to be attending to. People can do this, but what's interesting